around the censorship of national governments. I mean, I hear, I don't know if it's true or not, that in China, for example, at the time of me reading 2017, that there are about 200 million Chinese who use VPNs, virtual private networks. So the combination of the internet and VPNs should have the similar effect to the idea of very small EDSAT receivers, education satellite receivers. Back to the book. Chinese representatives at international meetings could be shunned and made to feel clearly the moral outrage of the rest of the world against Chinese leaders who in the eyes of the world are, quote, keeping the Chinese people poor and ignorant and keeping themselves in power at their people's expense. The Globa Media project, that is the idea of transmitting the world's media to the whole planet, would have a liberating effect on the planet if it were delivered globally by satellite and receivable by cheap small receivers that could be given in their billions to all the citizens of the world. Nearly all the remaining dictatorships would fall as a result, as people got educated. Only China would have the technical know-how to stop such an eventuality. This active process of ridding the world of its last dictatorships is called de-dictation. When might such a technology be available? I would say in the next few decades. The BRAD, B-R-A-D, bit rate annual doubling law of telecommunications still needs to work its magic for another decade or two before a satellite can transmit the world's media to the surface. Stationary orbit satellites would need to be able to send cross signals to other stationary orbit satellites so that an uplink can be distributed via crosslinks and then downlinked to the full surface of the globe. The cost of manufacturing billions of receivers would not be negligible. Perhaps the UN, United Nations, could do this. If not, then the growing global state, that is the rich democracies of the world, could pay the cost of their manufacture and distribution. Initial steps towards this goal may have already been taken in the creation of the $100 laptop, pioneered in the US. This project would be so important, it ought to be given a label, so I suggest the term the GSL project, that is, Global Satellite Learning. Ad-libbing. I'm more inclined, as I was saying a bit before, I'm more inclined now to the idea of just using the internet and VPNs. One of my major goals for the rest of my life is to be a globacator, global educator. I make PhD and master's level YouTube lecture courses in pure math and math physics, and I also make electronic libraries, e-libraries with links to tens of thousands of texts, to full content books, thanks to the links being provided by Google. So I'm playing my role in being a globacator, a global educator. I have such a strong belief in the enormous value of education to free people, to make them richer, make them happier, and of course as a strong prerequisite towards the creation of a global state, because I'd love to see the world rid of war and the arms trade. With such a technology, the world's best teachers in the Globiversities, discussed in Chapter 6, Section K, could have their lectures recorded and then broadcast across the planet. Well, that's ad-libbing now. That's what's happening now with the internet. Their lectures are transmitted via the internet, and we now have rock star professors, the best in the world. Particular emphasis could be placed on learning the world language and then transmitting the world's knowledge in a flood of information. A zillion educational programs could be falling out of the sky all at once. It's only a question of bandwidth, that is, how many bits per second can a single satellite radiate back to Earth? Or equivalently, how many bits per second can be transmitted along an optical fiber. Back to the book. For the receivers to be small, the wavelengths of the signals will need to be in the range of several millimeters, and hence the frequency of the signals will need to be high. How long will it be before future technologies can transmit millions of such signals across the planet? Once this is technologically possible, then a selection of messages would need to be made. Ad-libbing. Now that, those two major approaches, so the EDSAT receivers approach and the internet VPN approach, both, it's probably likely we'll see both. With millions of signals, a wide range of courses could be set up. For example, the basic language learning courses, the basic courses of primary and secondary schools, a worldwide history course and objective national histories written by third-party historians with no axe to grind concerning their own culture's history could be sent up. With 1 million signals, most of the usual university courses could also be transmitted. As the technology improves, perhaps several languages could be sent up, but for the globist, it would probably be better if only one language is used, to force people to speak the world language for the sake of easing the creation of the global state. A global language is seen by globists as a fundamental prerequisite for the creation of a global state. The global impact of such a GSL project, that's Global Satellite Learning, would be enormous. It would educate the planet to a high level. It would raise material standards of living. It would motivate people to improve themselves and give them the way to do so. It would help democratize the planet. No dictatorship lasts long once a sizable proportion of its people becomes educated and then demands a say in the control of their own lives. It would cause a surge of living standards in the poor countries as their populations get the message that things could be different, that they can get richer by becoming better educated. The global state could contribute significantly to this GSL project by funding the technological research that would be needed, as well as covering the considerable costs of building the satellites and rockets, as well as billions of receivers and then distributing them. A major part of the UN could then be devoted to the policy making of this project. For example, what should be taught, in which language or languages, what to do with dictatorial regimes who object, etc. The democratic globist politicians may feel that the few remaining dictators can go to hell and simply proceed to get the receivers to the masses of the dictatorial countries. The complaints of the dictators that the globists are infringing on the sovereign rights of the dictatorial countries will simply be dismissed by the globists, since such thinking will be considered by them to be outmoded, that is, 20th century, and no longer in tune with the march of history in the 21st century, whose ideology is globism, aimed at the creation of the global state. Also, the globists will not have much sympathy towards the complaints of the dictators, because they will feel that their globist actions are very much in the interest of the poor, ignorant peoples of the dictatorships. The globists will feel that they have the moral high ground, as the Americans say. The masses will be very hungry to lay their hands on the receivers, so there's plenty of potential for a black market, especially if the receivers are small and can be hidden easily. Perhaps the GSL project itself may be one of the most influential factors in ridding the world of its last dictatorship, that is, de-dictation. Ad-libbing, or the Brad phenomenon on the internet plus VPNs. The GSL project is only an idea at the moment. Its details need to be thought through. PhD theses need to be written on the many implications of the project, and then government agencies need to be set up to implement it. It would need to be fostered by the global state and further funded and implemented to enormous effect. It would not only educate the world, it would also liberate it. Thinkers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your ignorance. J. Global population migration. In a global state, the global government needs to consider the interests equally of all the world's citizens. This principle applies to where the various peoples of the earth can live. For example, some countries have population densities far higher than others. For example, Japan and Hong Kong. The Japanese and Hong Kongese, or Hong Kongers, are squashed together like sardines, with every square metre that is usable being used for something. In a global state, individuals will have the right to live wherever they choose to on the planet. There is an equivalent principle for citizens of the EU, European Union. European citizens can live wherever they want inside the EU. So at the time of writing, EU citizens can live in 27 different countries. In practice, not many people choose to move to another country unless they are pushed to by large economic differences in living standards. So as to avoid a flood of migrants from very poor countries to the richest countries, the EU institutions will not allow really poor countries to enter the EU until they have reached a reasonable threshold in material living standard. On a global scale, as more and more countries are absorbed into the dominant economic/political blocs such as the EU, one can expect a greater degree of heterogeneity of the populations living in the cities of these blocs. Step by step, country by country, the blocks will grow in size, and the heterogeneity in the cities will increase correspondingly. As blocks merge, so will the heterogeneity. Eventually, this process will spread to the whole planet, so that people will have the right to live wherever they want on the planet. They will be truly global citizens. Could not this idea lead to social problems in the case of mass migrations of a certain people to other areas of the world where the migrants are not appreciated? If, for example, Europe or the US suddenly opened its doors to China, then probably millions of Chinese would want to migrate to Europe or the US to benefit from the higher standards of living. The Europeans and the Americans would very probably resent seeing Chinese peasants with their peasant-like mentalities and hygiene standards coming into their countries in large numbers, bringing with them their crime levels and alien ways. But this would not happen. Political bloc leaders would only allow new countries to join the bloc once the economic differences between the new members and the old members were sufficiently small, so as not to disturb the status quo too much. The EU has been doing this quite successfully for decades, so they have a formula that works. This similarity principle between the old and new members applies not only to economic differences but to cultural differences as well. For example, Morocco once applied to become a member of the EU. It was rejected immediately on the grounds that the living standards and cultural differences were too great. That is, Morocco was too poor and not European. If Morocco can become a rich modern state, similar to the European countries, then the EU leaders would probably look more positively towards Morocco and other North African countries joining. On the borderline is Turkey, which has been trying for years to join the EU. EU leaders hesitate in the case of Turkey because in some ways it's a modern secular state, and in other ways it's still very Muslim and very unmodern. In time, as each country modernizes, gets richer, becomes solidly democratic, it will become eligible to join one of the economic/political blocs. Once many countries have done this, the remaining ones will be regarded as backward, inferior. This will hurt the egos of those countries, so one can imagine that they will become more motivated to modernize themselves so that they can be seen by other countries to be fit enough to join. The EU has a positive effect on candidate member countries and a stabilizing effect on them once they have joined. Once the East European countries joined the EU, it would be a disgrace and very costly economically for millions of business people if they were to be thrown out due to regressing in their political standards, for example, in becoming a dictatorship again. In practice, this does not happen. Empirical evidence shows that no country has ever reverted from democracy to dictatorship once its living standard has surpassed $6,000 per person per year. Not a single case. Ad-living, question mark. I'd need to check that now after a 10-year experience. So, the idea of sudden mass migration from one area to another is probably not on the cards. Such migration rights will need to be phased in as nations with similar living standards and cultural norms merge incrementally. In time, however, once a true Globa has been created, then full planetary migration rights will be given to all Globans. That is, individual global citizens will be free to move as they choose. What will then probably happen is that these Globans will diffuse and homogenize gradually until virtually every major city on the planet looks like the United Nations General Assembly Hall. There are already many such world cities, for example Brussels, New York, Paris, London, Berlin, Shanghai, etc. Well, not Shanghai. China's still too backward. As more and more cities take on this global appearance, and as these cities become accustomed to having people from all over the world, it will be easier for people to move to them from elsewhere. As the number of such cities increases, the more choices people will have as to where to move to. In short, in the next 100 years, we can expect our major and not so major cities around the world to become very culturally heterogeneous in terms of the numbers of cultures living in them. From another point of view, these cities will come to resemble each other more and more due to having the same mix of people. In that sense, they will become more homogeneous. Once this happens, people will argue to themselves that all cities are much the same, so why bother moving? Or alternatively, all cities are much the same, so it won't cost me much in terms of cultural differences to move where I will gain something. For example, lower house prices, lower population density, less polluted air, etc. K. From global economics to global happiness. In today's world, politicians are largely preoccupied by economic issues, particularly such issues as keeping up reasonable economic growth rates, keeping the unemployment and inflation rates down, and the like. Nowadays, leading politicians need to have economic backgrounds rather than backgrounds in law or other fields. In the rich countries, millions of people have already reached material living standards that can be described as affluent. This is not surprising. It was mathematically predictable. In fact, one of the most famous 20th century economists, John Maynard Keynes, pronounced Keynes, made this prediction, ironically, in the middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s. He wrote an essay which dealt with the consequences of compound interest over many decades on GNP, Gross National Product, predicting that the grandchildren of people alive in the 1930s would be rich. Those grandchildren are alive now and are indeed affluent, as Keynes predicted. It's therefore not surprising that millions of rich country citizens are now turning their attention to other preoccupations away from how they can earn more money. Even first world politicians are now starting to discuss how politics could be redirected away from economic concerns towards promoting greater happiness. The last few years, a growing number of books devoted to the topic of the science of happiness have appeared. The concept of happiness is now being investigated by scientists. What causes it? What happens in the brain when people feel happy? How can society be organized so as to increase general happiness levels? Should political parties have happiness policies, that is, policies on how to change the structure and organization of society so that general happiness is fostered, or correspondingly to eliminate those aspects of social and political structure that through ignorance lower happiness levels? As an example of happiness lowering through ignorance, take the American ethic of competition. Americans emphasize individual competition very strongly, much more than in any other culture I have lived in, that is 7 of them. Is this a wise policy? I can see easily that there are arguments both ways on this issue. In favor of competition is the idea that the best jobs should go to the best people. One does not want one's children to be operated on by incompetent, stupid surgeons who got their diplomas by corruption and bribes. Competition generates competence and an efficient society where services are performed well and reliably. I know what it's like to live in a culture where services are often not efficient and competent because there is not enough honest competition and too much corruption and bribery. That is, in China. I am very partial to competition, especially between companies. In China, the government keeps monopolistic control over certain industries, for example telecommunications, with the consequence that customer service is poor because monopolies face no competition, so they tend to become complacent and less innovative. Competition would keep them on their toes. I remember in the 1980s, when I was living in Belgium, with the nationalized telephone service, it could take 6 months to get a telephone. When I was living in the US in the 2000s, I could get a telephone installed the same afternoon. However, I do believe the Americans have gone overboard with their competitiveness to the extent that they generate a lot of mass unhappiness that is unnecessary. For example, if a classroom is learning some topic, all too often the teacher will think it quite normal to organize a competition to find the best student in that topic. So in a class of 30 students, there will be 1 winner and 29 losers. From the point of view of the whole class, what is the net effect of the competition? It made 29 students feel inadequate and only 1 feel superior. What is the point? If the teacher, the school and the culture had a greater awareness of the importance of raising happiness quotients, HQs, then they would probably not emphasize competition as much and rather concentrate on getting each student to do their individual best and not make ego-bruising comparisons. People would be happier that way. The US is rather brutal in terms of its neglect of people's feelings. How else do you explain, at the time of writing, America's lack of a national health service, its hillbilly gun laws, and its death penalty? I'll just comment ad-libbing here. I've commented on this gun laws in America several times, so I won't flog that. Back to the book. Once the science of happiness shows more clearly that today what happiness actually is and how best to generate it, then a true politics of happiness can be formulated. With a global government, this ought to be applied on a global scale. We should know better in the coming decades about what it is that generates happiness. Some of this knowledge will simply confirm what most of us already half know intuitively. For example, that a good marriage is very important. To achieve something that is difficult and that requires effort generates satisfaction. Having friends, being stimulated, travel, being creative, etc. The global government, as well as more local governments, could offer a friend-finding or mate-finding service with databases containing the data of millions or billions of people. If having friends or a loving mate is critical to one's happiness, then it's important that governments become involved in creating such support services. I would not be surprised that by the end of this century, happiness raising will be considered one of the most important tasks of any modern government. I'm running out of memory. I think I'll stop here. Ciao.